Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Seth Jones. I'm the president of the Defense and Security Department at CSIS, and I have the honor of talking today with Krista Auchenbach. She is a visiting fellow from the Office of the Secretary of Defense here in the Defense and Security Department at CSIS. I will note both the report that we're going to talk about and the discussion here that the views are solely those of hers and do not represent the views of the Department of Defense or the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Krista, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's talk about the main subject of your analysis. It's a really interesting subject, but it's one that I bet most people don't know much about, if at all, about. So let's start with the sort of the main theme, executive order, or EXORD. So for those with limited knowledge, what is it and why should people care?
So execute orders are the process by which the president will give an order to the military to execute operations. And so it's the codification of the president's Article 2 authorities as commander-in-chief to delegate down to a combatant commander for the execution of operations. And so with that, it sets the principles and the priorities and the purpose for the use of military forces and effects to achieve a strategic aim of policy.
So can you give us some examples so we can take what you've just outlined and understand like how that works in practice? Like what are some examples of what an EXORD might look like?
So all EXORDs are not created equal. And so there's different types of them, some of which can be very simple, kind of short duration tasks of being able to transfer, support to a foreign dignitary to travel from one place to another. It could be disaster relief or humanitarian response, so more high impact, but still relatively short duration type of missions. Or it could be those types of missions that really have to do with the maintenance of peace. And so when you think about freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, and some of those kind of broader global security efforts, EXORDs can also encompass some of those types of missions that the military is asked to do. And then, of course, they get into the higher end aspect of what is potentially armed conflict or war or the shaping of operations and deterrence operations. And so that's where it gets a little bit more complicated and nitty gritty in how the department manages those forces and effects and how that plays into risk and strategic aims of policy.
Okay, so you've given us a sense of what an EXORD is, a little bit of why it matters, and some examples. Can you talk about sort of what the problem or challenge is today? Why focus on the subject at this time? We'll get to some of the recommendations and what you think needs to be done differently, but can you lay out sort of the challenge right now?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is that the military is really good at doing the missions it's been given. And because of that, in some cases, it becomes an easy button in terms of being able to solve certain problems. That said, the world has gotten more complicated. And so the missions have actually expanded and the resources have not necessarily kept pace with the demand on them. And so when you look at how to prioritize the resources that we have, the missions that we're taking on, and what that means in terms of the current force employment and the opportunity costs or the trade-offs associated with readiness or future force employment considerations or potential contingencies, you get to this dynamic where if we're not keeping pace with supply and the demand is outpacing kind of what we can reasonably do, then we get to this matter of what is effectively coined strategic insolvency. And so this demand for how do we get after the security challenges in the world when the world is getting more complex and the threats are getting higher and our ability to keep pace with them is becoming harder, especially with budget uncertainty, is part of the reason why I was curious about this issue and then making sure that the use of the military element of power is fitting within the broader strategy.
So, and again, we'll get into some recommendations and some specific issues in a moment, but sort of big picture, what's your general sense of if we don't get this right and the Pentagon doesn't get this issue of EXORDs right, what's the challenge then that the U.S. has going forward?
So one of them is going to be this dynamic between how you keep pace with current deterrence operations and then future warfighting requirements. And so that's one of the key issues that energized a lot of the research that I did was how do we balance the future with the near-term threat? Another component of this has to do with the force readiness and modernization requirements that the department is trying to address and how force presentation considerations play into this broader discussion about the use of forces and effects. More broadly, there's this question of how is the military tool of power fitting in with the rest of the elements of national power? And are we appropriately ensuring, assessing, or making sure that the costs associated with those forces, particularly in terms of blood and treasure, but also those opportunity costs and reputational costs, are commensurate with the threats that we see coming down the horizon, and then again, the strategic aims for what we're trying to do as a country.
So one of the things you talk about in the report is you raise some concerns about what you call the accumulation of risk across missions, geography, and time. What does that mean? What does accumulation of risk mean from your perspective?
So the department is very good at taking on mission, and the can-do attitude that the military has is admirable and honorable. But we're very hard we have a difficult time as a department actually cutting mission. And so when you look at the accumulation of mission, the more that you're asked to do, and with limited resources, then it starts to have risk just in terms of the resource management of that. So with 11 combatant commanders all competing for those resources to be able to conduct their missions, you get into a scarcity issue that is certainly concerning to the department. And so that force allocation and reallocation question that comes up in these Secretary of Defense orders books is one where we have a game plan for how we're going to most effectively distribute the military forces to achieve these missions, but then the real world happens. And so as you continue to make decisions one-off in terms of being able to address those risks, it accumulates over time, not just across those combatant commands, but over time in terms of what it takes to recover readiness and what that means for potential future contingencies. And so the risk to mission, geography, and time is one where you're constantly trading between at least two, if not three, components of those variables.
So part of one interesting aspect of this is how does your work relate to one of the key responsibilities of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is best military advice and global integration? Where does this sit in the chairman's responsibilities?
So the chairman has responsibilities for the Global Force Management Allocation Plan and then also global integration and trying to help look across the different competing demands of the combatant commands and the services to be able to look at what is the most efficient and effective allocation of those forces. And so in doing so, provides those recommendations and hears the risks and the concerns and the perspectives from the services and the combatant commands in terms of what it means for force readiness and what it means for risk to mission, risk to force, and risk to strategy. And so the chairman has a critical role in being able to look across the military stakeholders to be able to present and represent those risks and those concerns to the secretary. Ultimately, however, because according to Clausewitz's policy, or war is policy by other means, the effective use of military tools and forces and effects are to achieve political aims. And so that decision ultimately rests with the secretary. And because he's in the chain of command, he's communicating and clarifying to the combatant commanders how he is allocating that risk. And so it becomes it's important for the chairman to be able to provide that global integration role and that perspective from the best military advice purview. But ultimately, it's going to be the secretary who has to look across the resources of the department, the aims of what the administration is trying to do, and how that trades risk within different combatant commanders and forces to be able to kind of capture and clarify and then codify that decision.
So let me finish with sort of getting to the specifics of what to do next. Yeah. So can you talk through some of your recommendations on how to fix the EXORD process? What does the department need to do going forward?
So one of the challenges, and it's difficult, it has been done a couple of times, but it is considered the mother of all tasks, is to look at the EXORDs individually and collectively in terms of how they stack up with where changes in terms of policy, priority, or approach necessitate changes. And so this is one where, again, all of the individual missions, all of the individual decisions make good sense. They're thoughtful. They've considered a variety of things, but when you look at them as they accumulate across the entirety of the portfolio, you start to see how that risk has changed and deviated from what the intent might have been at the outset in terms of how it relates to strategy, or how the world has changed and perhaps a different approach is necessary in order to make the best use of the resources that we have.
Sort of last question is, if you were to pick one sort of low-hanging fruit recommendation, sort of where to start with first, what would that recommendation be to sort of get the ball rolling on fixing? I mean, you've outlined a range of steps that need to be taken. Where do you start?
So one of the aspects that was interesting that came up through the research was just how much the understanding of how the different processes intersect was starting to wither within the department. And so looking at where the education is in terms of global force management, operations, and policy, and how those pieces fit together was one of the kind of easier and more straightforward lessons or recommendations that came out of this. Another one might be also to just, this is more of a cultural change than perhaps anything, is to look at how the situation has changed in the context of each individual mission. If for no other reason, EXORD should be reviewed to capitalize upon the success of how the military element has been used to date. And so really looking at what has changed in terms of the situation, the context, or the mission, and being able to update that so that you have the best realm and bound of guidance that you can give to an operational commander that will then empower lower echelons of command.
Is there any role for Congress to play in fixing and making recommendations here?
Certainly. I mean, one of the challenges is that the oversight of operations is something that is a balance between the military element of power, the resources and budget that's provided, and then again, kind of that Article 2 oversight of military force. And so there's certainly a realm for Congress to play in terms of, is the use of military forces and effects the right and most useful approach to what we're trying to achieve for the aims of national security policy. That's certainly one of them. A second one is, how are the risks in terms of resource management impacting our ability to remain solvent for the strategic priorities that the department has? And this is one where, in particular, the budget uncertainty has been profoundly unhelpful to some of the risks that have accumulated over time. So while the report largely talks about what DoD can do internally to get after this, making sure that we are achieving the strategic aims for the use of what we're trying to do is certainly one for Congress. And then secondarily, making sure that we have the resources on a timely basis to be able to make and outfit the military tool of power for the best possible kind of outcome for the missions that they've been assigned.
Well, thank you, Krista. One of the things and one of the reasons I like this subject so much is because just the use of EXORDs in my time in government, both in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and then in U.S. Special Operations Command, one of the combatant commands, they're critical to how U.S. military forces operate, but they are not well known outside of the department. And so I think what you've done here is highlighted an issue that needs some reform and then talked about a way forward. And I think it's an area that most people actually don't know a lot about. So appreciate you taking some time and shining a bit of a light on EXORDs, because I think it's high time for us to do that. So thanks for joining us and appreciate everything you've done.
Thank you.